Let's begin here because too many confuse effort with connection. Most people believe that if you want someone to love you, you must keep showing up, keep proving, keep giving. But what if I told you the most powerful shift comes when you stop, when you choose stillness, not to punish, not to play games, but to reclaim what was leaking out of you in tiny, invisible ways? This is not about being cold. It's about returning to center. And if that sentence made something in you pause, you're already on the path. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. We go deep here. Now listen closely. Because what most women misunderstand is this: they don't go unnoticed because they lack beauty, kindness, or love. They go unnoticed because they've made themselves emotionally predictable, always available, always replying, always reaching out to bridge the silence. But that kind of energy over time stops being felt. The heart adjusts to what is constant, and what once felt warm becomes background noise. Carl Jung warned that what we do not bring to consciousness will rule our lives as fate. In this context, it means that if you keep offering more without noticing the imbalance, you'll eventually feel empty, not because you are, but because you're no longer receiving. Think of this like a scale. When you give attention, comfort, reassurance, and receive little in return, your energy becomes a mirror, not of mutual care, but of one-sided need. And slowly, without meaning to, you begin to orbit around someone else's ego. That is not love. That is projection. Jung described projection as the act of giving parts of ourselves away, hoping they'll be returned in the form we long for. But that rarely happens, because the more you try to prove your worth, the more it slips through the cracks. Why? Because worth isn't proven. It's felt in silence, in absence, in stillness. The truth is, what is taken for granted only becomes visible when it's gone. And when you finally step back quietly, firmly, without bitterness, something happens. You become the gap they didn't expect. You become the question they never had to ask before. Not because you're playing hard to get, but because you've stopped giving yourself away so easily. This is the beginning of energetic power. Not in shouting, not in warnings, but in a soft internal choice. I no longer chase what drains me. Jung would call this the first step of individuation, when a woman stops shaping herself to be seen and instead allows herself to be whole even in silence. You don't have to make anyone miss you. You simply have to stop filling the space they never valued and let your absence do what your words never could. The rest of this story will walk you through how. But it starts here in the quiet, where true change begins. When a woman gives without limit, something subtle begins to shift. At first, it feels generous, even noble. The constant reaching out, the steady reassurance, the unwavering availability. But slowly, without realizing it, she disappears. Not in the physical sense. She still smiles, still texts, still shows up when he needs her. But her presence becomes assumed. Her light, once magnetic, now blends into the background. The warmth she offers is no longer cherished. It is expected. And that is the fracture. Not a loud betrayal. Not a sudden break. but the quiet erosion of value when something is always there. Carl Jung wrote that what remains unconscious will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. This is how it happens. The woman who keeps giving finds herself ignored, overlooked, forgotten, not because she lacks worth, but because she never gave space for her absence to be felt. In many ways, we are taught that love means proving, that if you care, you must always say so, always show up, always forgive, always be available. But this is not love. This is self-erasure disguised as devotion, and it's often fear that fuels it. Fear of being forgotten, fear of seeming cold, fear that if she pulls back even slightly, she will lose him. So she compensates. She checks in more, reaches out more, forgives more. She keeps the connection alive even when he's no longer meeting her halfway. But here's the truth. What is always available begins to feel optional, and what is optional is rarely valued. This is not her fault. It is a pattern, a deeply ingrained script, one that tells her to earn love through sacrifice, that if she just tries harder, gives more, waits longer, he'll finally see her. But the more she tries to be chosen, the more invisible she becomes. There is a concept in Jung's work known as the anima, the feminine energy that lives within all of us, including men. It is not loud or demanding. It is receptive, intuitive, deeply feeling. When a woman ignores her own anima, her own inner knowing, in order to serve someone else's needs, she disconnects from herself. And when a woman is disconnected from herself, she becomes easy to overlook. Not because she isn't radiant, but because her energy is no longer rooted in truth. It's wrapped around someone else's comfort, someone else's timing, someone else's attention. And yet her heart continues to give, because that's what she was taught, that giving is good and pulling back is selfish. But Jung invites us to look deeper. What if giving too much is actually a shadow in disguise, a form of unconscious control, trying to hold someone close by, never letting them feel the loss? What if overgiving is not selflessness, but self-abandonment? This is the painful paradox. The more she tries to keep him, the more she teaches him that she does not need to be kept. She becomes the one who adjusts, explains, forgives without being asked. She becomes the one who apologizes for her needs, the one who lowers her standards in the name of understanding. And in doing so, she reinforces a silent contract. You can offer me less, and I will still stay. And so he offers less, not always out of cruelty, sometimes simply because he can. The dynamic has been set. Her emotional labor fills the space between them. She becomes the bridge, the cushion, the glue, and he becomes accustomed to her doing the work. But love cannot be sustained by one side carrying both hearts. And still, she keeps going, because to stop feels dangerous. To pull back feels like failure. She fears that without her effort, the relationship will fall apart. And perhaps it will. But here is the question Jung would ask. What are you preserving, connection or the illusion of connection? When a woman is afraid to stop giving, she is not in love. She is in survival. And this survival mode runs deep. It is often passed down generationally, from mothers who tolerated too much, from grandmothers who stayed silent from a culture that equates loyalty with endurance. But there comes a moment when the pattern no longer serves her. a moment when the ache of being unseen becomes louder than the fear of being alone. That moment is sacred. It is the first crack in the mask, the persona she has worn for too long. The mask that says, I'm fine when she's not. The mask that says, I don't mind when she does. The mask that smiles while carrying the weight of unspoken needs. Jung called this the tension between the persona and the shadow. The outer self we show the world, and the inner self we've hidden even from ourselves. And when she begins to see the cost of that mask, she also begins to glimpse her truth. Because somewhere beneath the exhaustion, there is a voice that says, this isn't love, this is work, and I am tired. A voice that whispers, I don't want to be understood later. I want to be cherished now. And slowly, she starts to question, why am I always the one holding things together? Why am I afraid to be missed? Why does his comfort matter more than my clarity? These are not selfish questions. They are sacred ones. They mark the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole, not for anyone else's approval, but for her own peace. And that process often begins in grief. Grief for the version of herself that believed she had to earn everything. Grief for the love she poured into people who didn't know how to hold it. Grief for the years she spent being everything but herself. But this grief is not weakness. It is the doorway to her strength. Because once a woman sees the pattern, she cannot unsee it. Once she recognizes that she has been overgiving to avoid abandonment, she can begin to meet herself with honesty. She can begin to say, no more chasing, no more proving, no more holding my breath just to keep someone else comfortable. That is the fracture. Not of the relationship, but of the illusion. And though it hurts, it is the most powerful moment in her journey. Because when a woman realizes she has been shrinking to be loved, she also realizes she is allowed to expand again. She is allowed to take up space, to set standards, to pull back without guilt, to stop explaining, to let the silence speak. This is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of a new kind, one where she is seen not for what she gives, but for who she is, and who she is no longer invisible. When a woman begins to pull back, something shifts not only within her, but within the man who had grown used to her constant energy. The silence unsettles him. At first, he may not even realize why, but a space opens one he didn't expect. The attention that once flowed to him without effort is no longer there. The mirror that once reflected his charm, his worth, his importance, is now turned away. And with it, the illusion begins to crack. What many women don't see, at least not at first, is how their giving often feeds a man's ego far more than his heart. It comforts him, yes. It reassures him. But it also protects him from having to do the deeper work of seeing himself. And that Jung would say is the danger of the mask. Every one of us wears a persona, the outer identity we show the world. It helps us function, relate, succeed. But it is not the whole truth. Beneath that mask lives the shadow, everything we deny, avoid, or disown. In relationships, this dance between persona and shadow plays out quietly. A man may appear confident, composed, even detached, but behind that mask, he may carry fear. Fear of not being enough. fear of being abandoned, fear of being truly seen. And here is the paradox. The more a woman gives him comfort, the more she protects his mask. Because when someone always adores you, always forgives, always reassures you, don't have to question yourself. You don't have to grow. You just keep receiving. You stay asleep. And yet, ego is never satisfied. It craves reinforcement, but fears exposure. So when her attention fades, when her presence is no longer a guarantee, his mask begins to panic. He doesn't just miss her company. He misses who he gets to be in her presence. The man she reflected back to him. This is not about love. This is about ego regulation. And that's why her silence becomes so powerful. Because silence removes the mirror. When he can no longer see himself through her praise, her softness, her effort, he is forced to meet what lives underneath. The insecurity, the fragility, the hunger. Most men are not narcissists, but many have never been required to build inner emotional strength because someone else has always carried the emotional weight for them. And so when that weight is lifted, when she steps back, he doesn't know what to do with the emptiness. Some men react with anger, others with sudden affection, some with confusion. But all of it stems from the same place, the ego scrambling to restore its familiar reflection. Jung taught that until we confront our shadow, we project it. We place it onto the people closest to us. The parts of ourselves we deny our fears, our wounds, our dependency, we accuse others of triggering them. And so, a woman's silence becomes threatening. Not because she's being cruel, but because she's no longer playing the expected role. And this is where the game ends. When she stops replying right away, when she no longer posts to be seen, when she doesn't explain her distance, she is no longer feeding his need for reassurance. She is inviting him into maturity. Because real intimacy cannot exist when one person is doing all the work. When one gives and the other only receives, the relationship becomes a performance. And eventually, someone gets tired. Often it is the woman. Tired of keeping the peace. Tired of asking for clarity. Tired of proving she's worthy of what should already be mutual. But here is what many don't realize. Ego-driven connection is shallow, but addictive. It keeps both people locked in roles. One gives to be loved. The other receives to feel powerful. And both are afraid to change. Until someone breaks the pattern. When a woman withdraws with dignity, not with drama, not with resentment, but with clarity, she becomes a mirror, not of ego, but of truth. She no longer reflects his fantasies. She reflects his growth, or lack of it. And the ego cannot hide in that kind of light. In some cases, he will disappear. Not because she did anything wrong, but because he cannot survive without constant reflection. He needed her energy to feel significant. He needed her validation to feel secure. But in other cases, when there is real potential, he begins to awaken. He may not have words for it, but something changes. He begins to reflect, to wonder, to feel. And this reflection, this discomfort, is his first meeting with the shadow, the part of himself he avoided while she kept soothing it. And in this space, a new kind of connection becomes possible. But it requires that she not rush back in to rescue the dynamic, that she not comfort him just because he panics, that she let the silence do its work. Because silence, when chosen consciously, is not rejection, it is transformation. She becomes a threshold. The same woman who once calmed his ego now becomes the woman who challenges it, not with anger, but with boundaries, not with force, but with stillness. And through that stillness, he is left with a choice. He can step forward not to reclaim her, but to meet her, to see her not as a source of validation, but as a whole person. Or he can turn away and return to the safety of his mask. Either way, she has reclaimed something precious: her power, her clarity, her wholeness, because she no longer exists to support someone else's illusion of himself. She exists in her own truth, and that truth no longer bends to feed another's unexamined needs. This is the beauty of individuation. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming real. Letting go of the roles we were trained to play and choosing authenticity over performance. And that means letting the ego grieve. Because when you stop chasing, when you stop over-explaining, when you let the silence stretch, the other person is forced to decide who they are without your effort. And many won't like what they see. But the man who is ready, the man whose ego is not more important than his soul, he will rise to meet you. Not with charm, not with manipulation, but with presence. And until that happens, your distance is not a threat. It is a boundary. One that says, I will no longer participate in anything that asks me to abandon myself. And in the end, that boundary becomes your light. When a woman stops filling every silence, something rare begins to unfold. Not just in him, but in her. Because for the first time, she is no longer measuring her worth by his reactions. She is no longer bending to keep the conversation going, the connection alive, the atmosphere light. She is no longer afraid of being misunderstood or mistaken for coldness or thought of as too much for expressing her limits. She is simply choosing not to speak until it is true. And in that silence, everything hidden rises. Carl Jung taught that the unconscious speaks in symbols, and silence for many is the most powerful symbol of all. It is the space where certainty begins to crack and deeper truths emerge, not because someone explains them, but because the absence of noise finally allows them to be heard. We live in a world that values clarity, immediacy, constant access. But emotional growth does not happen in clarity. It begins in uncertainty, in doubt, in stillness. That's where reflection begins, not in the noise of constant reassurance, but in the quiet tension of wondering, what changed? When a woman withdraws her energy, she becomes something unfamiliar to him. No longer a predictable source of comfort, she becomes a question mark. And the human mind, especially the male mind, is wired to close open loops, to solve what it doesn't understand. So her silence becomes a magnet, not because it manipulates, but because it invites introspection, not just from him, but from her as well. She begins to feel the difference between reacting and observing, between pleasing and preserving, between being needed and being valued. This is the quiet shift into selfhood. And while the ego in him may first respond with confusion or resistance, something deeper is being stirred. He begins to wonder, not just about her, but about himself, about the space she filled, about what he gave in return, about the version of himself that only felt whole when reflected through her gaze. That absence, if he is open to it, becomes the beginning of his shadow work. And for her, silence becomes a practice, a way of listening to what she ignored for too long, a way of learning that not all presence must be explained, that not every pause requires a follow-up, that her value is not tied to how quickly she responds, how forgiving she appears, or how well she smooths the discomfort of others. It is here, in the quiet, that she stops performing. The persona, as Jung described it, is the mask we wear to adapt. It is shaped by what we think others want from us. For many women, that mask is pleasant, agreeable, available, undemanding. But it is not real. It is not the full self. When she goes silent, that mask starts to dissolve. And what rises in its place is her essence, not loud, not defensive, not desperate to be seen, just present and unbending, like a flame that doesn't flicker in the wind anymore. That is why silence isn't emptiness, it's revelation. To the man who only engaged when it was easy, her stillness is jarring. It unsettles his rhythms. It interrupts his narrative. He can no longer rely on her emotional availability to prop up his sense of control. She is no longer predictable. And in that mystery, he must face something uncomfortable. He is not entitled to her energy. And perhaps he never was. At first, he may mistake this silence for punishment, but punishment is about control. This is about release. She has stepped out of the performance and chosen the unknown. She no longer exists to soothe his fears or reflect his confidence. She exists in her own orbit now. That shift does not need to be explained. It only needs to be lived. And if he wants to understand, he must move toward her, not from panic, but from awareness. Not with charm, but with intention. Not to restore the old pattern, but to meet her as she is now. And many won't. They will misread her silence as cruelty, as indifference, as rejection. But that is the ego speaking, offended by the loss of attention, not awakened by the loss of intimacy. Because real intimacy begins where control ends. Jung believed that individuation, the journey toward wholeness, requires us to walk away from what is familiar but false. And often, what is most familiar is the version of ourselves we've shaped to be accepted. The woman who is always pleasant, always explaining, always holding space for everyone but herself. In silence, she lets that version die. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude, because it served her once. It protected her. It helped her survive. But now, it no longer honors her. This is the turning point, the moment when she stops asking, will he come back, and starts asking, am I returning to myself? She stops crafting messages to get his attention. Stops posting stories hoping he'll watch. Stops adjusting her schedule to leave the door open. Instead, she does something radical. She lets the distance speak. If he feels her absence and chooses to stay gone, then she has her answer. If he begins to wonder, to reach to return with clarity, not confusion, then perhaps something deeper is possible. But either way, her energy is no longer negotiating. She is not using silence to punish. She is using it to remember what it feels like to wake up and not wonder what he's thinking, to move through her day without shaping it around his moods, to sit with her own discomfort and realize it's not emptiness, it's freedom. This silence becomes a sanctuary, and slowly she learns to trust it, to trust that what's meant for her will not require her to chase, that her energy, when turned inward, begins to heal what she thought only love could fix, and that healing becomes visible. She dresses differently, speaks differently, feels lighter, more rooted, less concerned with timelines, replies, signals. She has stepped off the stage. She has stepped into herself. And what's most powerful of all, he can feel it. He may not understand it. He may not even name it. But the shift is undeniable. The energy she once poured outward is now being held, and it glows differently. Not in need, but in clarity, in stillness, in self-trust. This is the power of mystery, not as a tactic, but as a byproduct of truth. When a woman stops trying to be chosen, she becomes someone worth choosing, not because she withheld love, but because she no longer offers it without care. She has become the mirror he didn't expect. And now, if he wants to see himself clearly, he must meet her where she stands. In silence, in depth, in truth. Because the old pattern has ended, and a new version of her is being born. By now, something inside her has changed. She no longer waits to be chosen. She no longer rushes to explain herself. She has stopped reacting out of fear and started responding from alignment. And though it may look like silence on the outside, it is anything but empty. This is not withdrawal. It's a return to the place where she honors what she feels without asking permission, a return to where she knows what she deserves without needing to prove it, a return to the truth she once buried beneath overgiving, over-explaining, and overextending. Carl Jung often said that real change does not come from willpower, but from becoming conscious of what we were once unconscious of. And when a woman begins to see her old patterns clearly, without judgment, without shame, she can finally begin to live differently. Not just speak differently, not just think differently, but act differently. Because boundaries are not words. Boundaries are behaviors. It's easy to say, I want to be respected. It's harder to hold still when someone tests that. It's harder to not reply immediately, to not accept the apology that comes without change, to not answer the late-night message, to not soften the silence when it begins to feel uncomfortable. But this is where her power lives now, not in declarations, but in decisions. And those decisions are often quiet. She doesn't send long explanations. She doesn't post cryptic quotes. She doesn't warn him about losing her. She simply becomes unavailable to what drains her. Because what you tolerate teaches others how to treat you. And this time, she no longer tolerates being the one who always bends first. She no longer rushes to fix what she didn't break. She no longer accepts partial presence, breadcrumb affection, or connection on someone else's terms. That shift is not loud, but it is unmistakable. It lives in the way she doesn't make herself small to keep the peace, in how she turns down the invitation that comes last minute, in how she doesn't answer the call that only comes when it's convenient for him. She no longer asks, "What should I do to be loved?" She asks instead, "Does this reflect the love I offer?" And if the answer is no, she doesn't try to shape it. She steps back with grace, with clarity, with consistency. That is what unsettles the ego most, not defiance, but distance, because it reveals that she is no longer emotionally available for confusion, no longer showing up for promises unkept, no longer hoping that someday he'll change. She has chosen to stop waiting, and in doing so, she becomes someone who cannot be toyed with. This is where individuation becomes visible, not in theory, but in form, in posture, in tone, in presence. She no longer chases what won't meet her. She doesn't perform to be picked. She doesn't plead to be seen. She embodies her standard without having to announce it. And here's the deeper truth. When a woman truly sets a boundary, it is not about punishment or superiority. It's about protection. Protection of her peace, of her energy, of her spirit. It's a way of saying, I honor myself enough to stop leaking where I'm not received. Jung would say that the unlived parts of us don't disappear. They find ways to surface. And for many women, the part that has gone unlived the longest is self-respect. Not the kind that looks like pride, but the kind that refuses to settle. The kind that no longer trades presence for potential. The kind that knows love is not something to be earned, but something that must be mutual. So when she starts acting from this place, everything shifts. He may notice her absence and reach out. He may test the waters to see if her old self still lives there. He may send just enough to keep the door open. But this time, she doesn't walk through. Because she now knows that attention is not affection. That effort without consistency is not commitment. That a man who truly values her won't need her silence to realize her worth. He will show it in how he moves toward her, in how he stays, in how he listens not to respond, but to understand. And if he doesn't, she no longer considers that a loss, because she has already found something far greater than his approval. She has found her edge, the place where she no longer negotiates her intuition, where she no longer shrinks in the face of someone's uncertainty, where she no longer holds on to the hope of who someone could be at the cost of who she's becoming. This edge is where real love begins, because only from that place can she meet someone as an equal. Only from that place can she say yes without resentment, no without guilt, and leave without explanation when her peace is threatened. This is not a performance of strength. This is the quiet reality of wholeness, and sometimes she surprises even herself. She sees the message come through and doesn't feel the old urgency. She notices he's watching her stories and doesn't feel the pull to post again. She hears through a friend that he's asking about her and doesn't rush to respond. Why? Because her life has moved forward. And more importantly, her energy is no longer seeking. It's receiving. Receiving clarity. Receiving stillness. Receiving the kind of inner safety she used to beg for in someone else. This is the moment Jung might call integration, where the shadow no longer controls her in secret, but has been met with light, where the unconscious pattern becomes conscious behavior, where the wound no longer runs the show. Because she has seen it named, it honored it, and chosen not to repeat it. And that choice is sacred. It doesn't make her cold. It makes her clear. It doesn't make her distant, it makes her deliberate. And the people who are meant to love her truly will rise to meet her there, not out of fear of losing her, but out of the desire to walk beside her in truth. And those who don't, they fall away not by force, but by friction, because her energy no longer makes room for contradiction. She has stepped fully into her standard, not a list of demands, but a way of being. She no longer hopes for change. She lives as the change. And from that place, she creates a boundary so strong it doesn't need to be spoken. It is simply lived in every choice, in every silence, in every step forward that no longer looks back. By now, the silence is no longer uncomfortable. It's familiar, sacred. A quiet space that once felt like emptiness has become a form of truth. It holds her boundaries. It honors her growth. It reflects her strength without needing to raise her voice. Because now, she no longer seeks peace. She is peace. There is nothing more powerful than a woman who no longer performs for love, who no longer offers her energy in exchange for being seen, who no longer molds herself to be palatable, pleasing, or predictable. She has remembered something ancient, something forgotten in the noise of trying, that she was never meant to be earned, never meant to beg, never meant to shrink her worth into something someone else could finally recognize. Carl Jung taught that in the second half of life, the question is no longer, who am I to them, but who am I to myself? And when a woman reaches this moment of quiet knowing, the entire balance of her life begins to shift, because now she does not chase, she invites. She does not explain, she embodies. She does not ask, will he stay? She asks, does this align with who I am now? And this version of her does not settle. She has lived through the giving. She has tasted the silence. She has watched the mask fall. And she has made the most powerful decision of all, to let go of the version of herself that was only ever loved in fragments. She walks differently now, not hurried, not hesitant, but grounded, rooted, clear. There is no longer a craving to be chosen, because she has chosen herself. Not once, but every single day, she holds her standard. Every time she lets someone go who cannot meet her there. Every time she honors the pause instead of filling it. That is what individuation looks like. Not just understanding who you are, but living it, holding it, becoming it in your daily rhythms, your presence, your silence. And from this place, a woman no longer needs to declare her worth. It is felt, not in how loud she is, but in how little she entertains what drains her. She understands now that love is not something to chase, that when it is real, it arrives without fear. It does not require her to abandon herself. It does not ask her to compromise her dignity for closeness. It shows up, not in fantasy, but in presence, not in promises, but in consistency. And even if it hasn't arrived yet, she is not waiting, because she is already whole. This is the quiet revolution that happens when a woman detaches from ego-driven dynamics, when she no longer reacts from the wound, but from the wisdom the wound gave her, when she no longer repeats the pattern, but gently, firmly breaks it. She is no longer seeking a man to make her feel chosen. She is building a life that reflects her choosing herself. And in doing so, something unexpected happens. She shines, not for attention, not for control, but from alignment. And men can feel it. The ones who once overlooked her begin to notice. The ones who took her for granted begin to wonder. But now, she is not moved by wonder. She is moved by truth. Not by longing, but by clarity. If someone returns, they must return differently. If someone stays, they must stay fully. If someone speaks, their words must match their actions. Because the days of guessing are gone. The days of half-love are over. The door is no longer open to what only offers pieces. Jung said that what we fail to integrate becomes our fate. But when we do integrate it, when we finally see the wound, understand the pattern, and honor the shift, we reclaim our destiny. She has done that now. She doesn't need applause for it. She doesn't need anyone to say they see it. The beauty of this transformation is that it speaks on its own, in how she rests, in how she chooses, in how she no longer rushes to fill silence or fix what is not hers to fix. She is no longer in the business of convincing, only in the business of aligning. And this is where peace lives. Not in the resolution of every relationship. Not in the return of the one who once left. But in the inner knowing that she never had to become anyone else to be worthy. She only had to remember who she was before the pattern. And now she has. This final stage is not a performance. It's a presence, a stillness, a quiet knowing that needs no explanation. She walks away not to punish, but to return. Not to make him suffer, but to stop suffering herself. Not to be missed, but to feel herself again whole and uninterrupted. She walks away to come home. To the woman who no longer lowers herself to stay connected. To the woman who can sit in silence and feel safe. To the woman who no longer accepts confusion where clarity should live. She walks away, and in doing so, she remembers the only love worth keeping is the one that meets you where you stand. Not the one that follows when you beg, but the one that arrives when you're no longer performing. And if no one arrives, that's not a loss. That is a gift, because the woman she has become in the silence is already everything she was looking for. So take a moment now. Breathe into that knowing. There is no rush, no chase, no proving left to do. There is only peace and the kind of self-trust that cannot be stolen, only reclaimed. And if someone out there sees you from this place of wholeness, not from your old patterns, but from your truth, let them come. Let them speak. Let them stay. But let them meet you. Not the mask you used to wear. Because the most beautiful chapter of your life begins here. In stillness, in strength, in the deep, quiet radiance of finally coming back to yourself. If something in this story resonated, let it rest with you a while. And when you're ready, feel free to share in the comments where you are on your journey. You never know who needs to hear that they're not alone. And remember, your silence, when rooted in self-worth, speaks louder than any explanation ever could. See you in the next one.